Okay, we had people ask for the recording, so we will make sure to get that for them. Th One again, thank you all for being here. At a time when many of us think about how little positive things will be coming on the political realm at the federal level, it's important to think about the work that we can do at the state level to make change. And one of the things motivating all of us here is the fact that having a more, let's say, small d democratic, accountable, responsive state government is critical to the work that we all want to see in moving our state forward and making our state government a place that is more able to responsive to the many needs that we already have and that we will be having in the years to come. Right, shortly. I realized I began without introducing myself. Hello, my name is Jonathan Cohn. I'm the policy director at Progressive Massachusetts. I'm just gonna like quickly introduce this and what we're doing tonight. So I'll just be sharing my screen, uh, and then you'll be hearing from several other people as well, and then me again. So let me get this shared. Okay. Thank you as first of all to all of you joining us this evening. And thank you to our co-hosts tonight here with Progressive Mass, where I'm joining from, Act on Mass, Progressive Democrats of Mass, the Massachusetts Sierra Club, and the Cambridge Committee for Transparency and Accountability. So, what are we here doing tonight? Uh, what we'll be doing, we'll learn a little bit about how did we get to where we are? Why are we talking about transparency and open government? Why does it matter? We'll talk about what we've been pushing for in the current session. So how did we get here? Then where are we? Uh, and then we'll hear a little bit about where things stand in that process in the legislature, both what we asked for, what's happened so far. Then we'll turn toward what is to come and how we can influence that with us taking an action together, because taking action together is more fun than taking action by oneself. And then for those willing, we know that the calls that we can guarantee get made are the calls that we ourselves make, but we can also ask other people to take action. And so the end of the meeting will be devoted to that as well. So I will hand it over. I will hand it over to Scotia, who's going to be doing the next few slides. So Scotia, I'm going to put you on spotlight and take myself off. Okay, Scotia, take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. Um, okay. I'm Scotia. I'm the executive director of Act on Mass. And some of these slides might be a bit familiar. We're just going to do like a little transparency 101 of why we're talking about this and why government and accountability and transparency is especially important right now. Yeah, next slide, I guess. Okay, so this is something that you guys might all be familiar with in your work as advocates, which is that although we're well known for being a, beacon for bold political action, blue state, safe blue state, very, very popular progressive legislation just does not make it through our legislature. These are very popular policies, even things that are part of our state's democratic platform, often will die over and over again, session to session, in our legislature. Some of these bills that have come up recently, same-day voter registration, the Safe Communities Act, which you guys might know was introduced in 2017 during the first Trump administration to protect our most vulnerable residents from policies on the federal level, and that has just continued to die in the House for 10 years in a row. The Healthy Youth Act, Stop Wage Theft, Medicare for All. I'm betting that many of us on this call have made calls in favor of these bills, have submitted testimony in favor of these bills, and unfortunately, year after year, the State House is failing its constituents, letting us down. And unfortunately, we don't have many means for understanding really what's going on in the building. And next slide. That is because of the unfortunate ways that our state democracy works, which is on the left, we have, I have a handy dandy, so again, classic Act on Mass graphic for how our system should work. Ideally, we get the chance every 2 years to choose our representatives based on the policies that they said that they support. And so there's kind of this push and pull between representatives and legislators where representatives and their communities where we get to decide every 2 years based on their record, whether we want to elect them again. Unfortunately, in the Massachusetts State House, you can go to the next slide. There's two key blocks to this process, which is that number one, most of the legislating happens behind closed doors. There's a lack of transparency, and also there's an enormous concentration of power and leadership, which means often that even our rank and file representatives that are intended to represent us struggle to make legislation happen on their own, just because of the extreme amount of power that the House Speaker and Senate President have over our political system. And the result is that everyday people are locked out of the process. So you and me are very much disempowered in our ability to really enact change within our state legislature. Next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Jess from Sierra Club, who's going to just talk a little bit about what this looks like as an advocate and kind of the frustrations of navigating this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Hi, folks. I'm Jess Nahigian. I'm the political director for the Massachusetts Sierra Club chapter. And you might have heard that last session there was an epic battle over a climate bill that did finally pass. I was one of the many advocates who was in the thick of things. And I want to say that this past session was particularly bad, but this process has really been terrible for years now. And so what we saw last session, not only in the climate space, but in many other areas progressives care about, was a continuation and a worsening of a trend that has been going on for a long time. Every part of this process is designed to shut out the public and to consolidate power. And how does that impact advocates? It means that processes are opaque, processes are hard to navigate, and it's really hard to know as an advocate how you can even affect change. Now, practically, what did that look like last session? Well, it meant that we often have to scramble to prepare for a hearing with only a couple of days' notice. The whole point of hearing a bill is to hear testimony from different people, often hopefully from impacted people. How are you supposed to prepare and present good testimony if you don't know that the hearing's even happening until a few days before it happens? All right. Another way that it affects the process, once you have the hearing, there's no record of all of the written testimony that gets submitted. How do we know what's even being said in these hearings unless somebody says it out loud in the hearing room, right? And then there's the committee votes, which is perhaps one of the only ways we know they're one of the only times a legislator has the opportunity to vote on an issue directly or on a bill directly, because so many of our bills end up in these huge omnibus bills that end up with a yes or no, up or down vote. And so committee votes are where they can actually show whether or not they support an idea. And yet these committee votes are not public. So how are you supposed to know as a constituent, as an advocate, who is supporting what issue? They can tell you one thing, but what are they actually doing? We don't know. So these are just a couple of the examples of how this process stymies advocacy and some of the reasons that we need change.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. I imagine many people on this call would share some of those frustrations or have similar experiences. And I know Jonathan said it at the beginning, but the last couple of weeks have made it all too clear that we really need leadership from our state leaders right now. And we need to be able to present kind of an alternative. So why are we talking about this now? Because the movement for state house reform is growing. So this kind of early moments in the movement was the People's House campaign 2021. There was like a public upswell for transparency and for government accountability. In 2020 and 2022, you saw some non-binding ballot questions pass where 87% of Massachusetts voters supported public committee votes. And then, of course, this fall, we had question one for a legislative audit where 72% of voters across Massachusetts in every single town in Massachusetts voted that the legislature cannot be trusted to audit itself. We want more public scrutiny. We want things to be made public. And yeah, this was the most popular issue on the ballot. Next slide, please. So there's clearly a huge public outpouring, for the growing public awareness that transparency is an issue. And yeah, the voice is becoming louder, and the powers that be are being forced to pay attention. So this legislative session opened with remarks from the man himself, the woman herself, Speaker Ron Mariano, and Senate President Karen Spilka, promising transparency reforms, that they would do more to be a transparent body, and yeah, giving lip service at least to these concerns about transparency. Of course, they have not followed through on question one. But we're here to talk today about how they are following through on these promises. This is how they open the session, saying, "We're listening to you. We want to become a more transparent body." And at that point, it's the public's turn to respond. Well, what does transparency look like to us? And John's going to talk about an effort to really make clear what transparency looks like to the public.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, kind of bringing us to where we are now. So basically, as Scotia was just noting, at the beginning of the year, the Speaker and the Senate President said that they wanted to take steps to boost public confidence in the legislative process. And that was definitely a result of the broad public support for question one. That was also clearly a result of how they were savaged by the Globe throughout last year, for various criticism of the Boston Globe, particularly the investigative team, about various problems in process. Let me quickly figure out why there's annotation on the screen. I don't know if that might try to figure out that later. It's because somebody seems to be annotating the screen, because I don't think it's from the slide deck, but that'll be an issue for another time. Let me just fix this. And so at the start of the session, came the key question of if the Speaker and the Senate President are going to talk about public accountability and public trust, it is on us, the public, to determine what public accountability and public trust looks like. It is not the opportunity of, it should not be the legislators themselves, particularly and especially the legislative leadership, setting benchmarks for what that looks like. So a group of us came together to think about what are the demands that we would want to make to set the standard for what that looks like. What does a process look like that is actually inclusive of the public, that is accountable, that is responsive, that boosts trust in the process, that empowers rank and file members, rather than the closed top-down model of legislating that we so often have. And because we know that when you have closed doors, the only people who typically get behind them are those with the most money, who can pry their way behind any closed door. So about a month ago, a group of 30 organizations sent a letter to the State House endorsing a suite of reforms, saying that as you take up the rules, since you've both talking about how you want to become more transparent, this is what that looks like. And at the bottom is a quote from that about how this set of demands constitute necessary steps along the path towards the very legislature which the people of Massachusetts have clearly demanded. So I want to give a shout out to the organizations that endorsed that. I'm not going to read off every single name because that takes too much time. But thank you if you're here from one of these organizations. Thank you for signing on. If you haven't yet signed on but would like to, know that you still can, and that we want your support because everybody's support matters. And then, okay, so I'm going to highlight a few of the pieces of this as well, and then hand it over to Peter Enrich from Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts to continue. So we divided that letter of demands into 4 parts, with the first part being about improving public access to information. One thing that I would highlight with this is about a decade ago now, the legislature updated the public records law. And in that, one of the things that they included was a commission to study whether the legislature should be subject to the public records law. Surprise, the legislature did not decide to subject itself to the public records law, and the commission itself dissolved with no recommendations. However, among the recommendations of the Senate members of that commission, which finished in 2019, were things like making committee votes public and making testimony public. And so the question is why? As Jess had noted earlier, in the different committees that constitute kind of the work of the State House, their work is a black box. It is done behind closed doors with little that becomes public. Every bill gets a hearing, and because every bill has a hearing, and every bill does get a vote, but we as the public don't know how our representatives and our senators are voting in the joint committees between them, deciding whether to advance bills out of committee, whether to kill them entirely, whether to like politely kill them in the way that sending something to study. It like is if we don't know that, it is harder to hold them accountable because they can tell you that they support something, but they can work against it behind closed doors. And having them have to actually show their votes every step of the way helps empower us as the public in understanding what is happening, when is it happening, and how can we influence it. It's also true that most states already do this. So it's not something that is particularly out there concept or a particularly difficult concept. Majority of US state legislatures already do this, including many of the state legislatures around us, like in Connecticut and Maine, or other similar blue trifecta states like California and New Jersey, that that it's votes are a core tool of accountability. And what we've seen, as Scotia noted before, whenever this has been put to the ballot, there's overwhelming support for doing that. We care about what our legislators are doing. Testimony is also a critical thing to be able to see. So what that is, if you've ever attended a hearing, watched a hearing, spoken at a hearing, you see all of you'll see the different speakers. But the testimony that gets sent to the written testimony that gets sent to the legislature, it basically enters like kind of a black hole from the outside perspective. That you don't know who's sending things in, who's trying to influence it. You don't know who's on what side of an issue, which can be a critical way of understanding something if you don't know all of the dimensions of an issue ahead of time. It's helpful as the public to see what arguments people are making on your side and on the opposing side. It's critical as a rank and file legislator to understand what's at stake kind of in an issue. And it's something that the public should have access to as well. As I noted, other states already do this, like again, Maine and Connecticut nearby us. And the legislature has even shown an ability to do this as well, as the House did back in 2020 during the police reform debate. The technology exists, there's no reason for them to not make that information public. As I like to say, information wants to be free. We also had a few asks around increasing public engagement in the legislative process. So specifically around hearings. I won't be able to see your hand. Like, don't use the hand raise function, but just like manually raise your hand if you've ever attended a hearing or signed up to speak at a hearing at the state legislature. So many of you do have familiarity with that. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that those hearings are more accessible to the public than they are now. One of those, and it listed a few different things to make that happen. One is providing adequate notice of hearings. As it stands, the legislature can announce a hearing in 72 hours. That's not enough time for regular people to change around their schedule and participate. What we had noted is that most people have jobs where they need 2 weeks notice before like taking out time for vacation, and there's no reason to not provide that same degree of notice for any hearings coming up so that people can make plans if they're traveling or even if they're testifying remotely. People shouldn't have to scramble last minute or only learn about a hearing after it happened. The legislature also has the ability to just create a calendar early on. They don't need to wait until 72 hours before something decide. They probably made that decision a long time ago, and the public should know when that happens. That also, as folks who've attended hearings know, they can often go on forever. And if they go on forever, that makes people less likely to participate and less likely to stay till the end, maybe not leave before their voice even gets heard. And so called for them to limit further the number of bills per hearing. Every bill needs a hearing, and we have a full-time legislature, and they have the ability to hold the number of hearings that they need to give legislation its due, rather than cramming things into larger and larger hearings. We know that if people take time out of their day to testify, knowing when they are speaking is a basic respect. It is something afforded to legislators. When any legislator shows up at a hearing, they can be taken out of turn. But if you, as a regular member of the public, testify, you have to wait any length of time that you might not know know at the start, whether you're going in 30 minutes or in 30 minutes or 5 hours from the start time, you don't know. And if you're trying to fit this with other things in your day, if you want to eat, if you have other meetings, if you're trying to testify virtually, having that sense of when you're going helps increase the number of people who are able to testify and make their voice heard. And lastly, one thing that was a great benefit from the expansion of hybrid testimony that we saw last session was the ability of people who are currently incarcerated to testify on issues that impact them. We saw that for the first time with the hearing about the prison moratorium bill, a bill to put a 5-year moratorium on the construction of prisons and jails in the state. And the women from MCI Framingham were able to testify directly on that issue that impacts them. And that's we know that policymaking is best when the people directly impacted are able to make their voice heard and able to raise the issues that they experience day to day. And we wanted to make sure that that ability is kept, that make sure that people who so often don't have that ability to speak are not shut out of it at any time, and that new advance is kept and made secure. So I'm going to hand it over now to Peter Enrich from Progressive Dems of Mass to talk about a few additional things from this letter.
Thanks, Jonathan. And let me join Scotia and John in welcoming all of you and saying how thrilled we are that so many of you were willing to come out and be involved in this process. I think we're on a trajectory where we hopefully can actually accomplish some real change. So let me talk about a couple further things that we demanded in our letter to the legislators about what if they really wanted rules that really improved the process and opened it up to the public in a meaningful way that they would include. And I think the first place to go beyond simply opening up the committee process so that we can see what's going on and so that it's easier for us to participate, the committee process itself has become profoundly broken. I worked in the Dukakis administration back a few years ago, and in those days, those of us who were working on legislation, after the committee hearing, we would go to what was called an executive session, what in Congress would be called a markup session, in which the members of the committee actually sat together, talked about the bills that they were considering, discussed what they wanted to do with them. Staff would recommend changes and alternatives. And after some discussion in an open meeting, they would take a vote of what to do with the bills in a way that I often was disappointed with the depth of the discussion and how much appeared to be being decided before they even got into the sessions. But they did actually sit together and talk and debate before they took votes. That hasn't happened in decades now. Instead, the process is one where the chair quietly moves things forward, takes a poll, usually without the committee ever convening, with no real discussion, not only no transparency, but no real involvement by the people who we elect and who we're in a position to hold accountable. So one of the critical changes is to revert to that older system, a system that's still in place in many legislatures around the country and in Congress, where after the hearing on the bill, the committee meets in a public markup session in which it's a public session. They can decide how much they want to discuss, how much they don't want to discuss, but we can watch and see and understand what it is that they are thinking. They have space to disagree. They have space to work out compromises. They have a process that is actual lawmaking instead of leaving that all to leadership behind closed doors. So that's the requirement that every bill pass through a public committee markup session at which its fate beyond the committee is decided. The thing that goes quite naturally along with that is an expectation that they explain themselves, that they publish a committee report that at least briefly describes why they did what they did and what they actually did do with each of the bills that was before them. If they're going to do all of that, it's putting a much different role on the committees than they presently play. And so that really does require some significant adjustments to the timelines. One of the critical pieces set in the joint rules is the so-called Joint Rule 10 day, which is the day by which each committee is to have reported out or decided on each of the bills before it. Lots of exceptions are made to the Rule 10 deadline. A lot of things get extended, but it is an important benchmark date for moving legislation forward. It is presently well into the second year of the two-year session of the legislature, and it's part of what explains why we end up with bills all being reported out at the very last minute and ending up in conference committees that either do or don't complete their work by the end of the normal end of the session on July 31st of the second year of the session. So we proposed moving the Rule 10 deadline date up to late in the first year of the session instead, which would allow more leeway and time for the legislative process to move forward. Often, after a bill is reported out by its committee by the Joint Rule 10 day, it goes to the Ways and Means Committee. And so there's additional process that requires time, and then there's time needed on the legislative calendar and for what one would like to think could be some actual legislative discussion and debate. All of that requires moving those deadlines earlier. For those bills that have gone through the process the previous year and have been favorably reported out of their committees, leaving that until the very late, even the late in the first year, the very late Joint Rule 10 day simply doesn't make sense. Those bills have already made it through a significant process. They should be moved sooner so that there's some possibility of them actually making further progress through the process. We proposed that they have to be reported by July of the first year of the session, which again still gives the committees a fair amount of time and space. The next piece that is in the rules that we thought was important to tackle is the role of conference committees. And I think everyone watched the process this past fall in which most of the major legislation before the legislature ended up in conference committees that didn't get their work done by July 31st, and that then went on meeting well into the fall, sometimes into the winter, before they came out with a bill that had to be voted up or down by each house, with no public awareness of what that process had been. So the most important thing that we would like to change in the rules about conference committees is to require them to meet in open session so that that process could be seen. Again, if you go back 30 or so years, those the conference committees, they sometimes did work behind closed doors. They're small committees, so they can work quietly. But when they actually got to the point of making decisions about what they were report out, that was done in open session. And that, especially in a world where that's where most legislation ends up getting decided, really needs to be accomplished. Now, the other thing that we were concerned by and are concerned by is the process that we saw last fall, in which after the legislature was no longer meeting in regular session, those conference committees continued on for weeks and months in secret, and then suddenly popped up with bills that were passed in without public session, without full formal sessions of the legislature to allow discussion and debate before voting on them. Um, One of the things that the Senate president had indicated she was interested in doing when we wrote our letter was in extending the date for conference committees to continue beyond the July 31st end of the second year of the session. That strikes us as profoundly mischievous. It's a way of giving even more power and control to these very small leadership dominated conference committees in a way that cuts the rest of the legislature and you and me out of the entire process. So one of the things that we said very explicitly in our letter is that the idea of extending conference committees beyond July 31st was a very bad idea that would be contrary to the goals of expanded transparency. So a couple more, move on to the next slide if we can, and I'll be done momentarily. Last piece, and again, this just seems so obvious. There's not much to be said about it. At this point, bills can be reported out of committee and presented on the floor in as little as 24 hours. These, especially in a world where the legislature increasingly is relying on these omnibus bills that do a dozen or 1,000 different things in an area, to have those come out and have legislators have to decide and file any amendments within a 24-hour window is simply unworkable. It's a way of cutting the legislators out of the process. So we proposed a minimum requirement of 72 hours between the report of the bill to the floor and the floor vote. And in addition, we recommended that there be at least some minimal opportunity for legislators to actually familiarize themselves with amendments being presented on the floor. So again, this set of reforms would make the process somewhat better. Rules reform alone can't solve the problems of leadership dominance. It can't solve all of the problems of the openness of the process. But at least if you were serious about using your rules to make the system work better and work in a way that made legislators more accountable and gave them more engagement in the lawmaking process, these would be a bare minimum. So I think I am now passing it back to Scotia to talk about what the Senate actually did.
Yeah, I'm just gonna unshare and reshare. So let me just bring this back up in 1 second, and then let me bring you up, Scotia, and take Peter off spotlight, and then I will reshare my screen. Okay.
All right.
Scotia, take it away.
Thank you, John and Peter, for giving us, such a great kind of explanation of what our demands for. I know that you guys are all here for action. We are going to be getting to some really important, we're taking action together in just a couple minutes. But first, we want to tell you what the Senate actually did. So this was our demands. This is what we told Senate and House leadership. This is what transparency looks like to the people. And the Senate actually released their rules packages the week before last and voted on it last week. And so we used our demands in our joint letter to actually make an assessment of what the Senate actually did. So before we ask you to tell your reps what we want them to do, we're just going to let you know what the Senate did. So here it is. To start off with some good things. Obviously, our first two demands were to make committee votes public, make committee testimony public. What's interesting is that the Senate for the last couple of years has introduced this in their joint rules, and this is a key point of contention where House and Senate do not agree because the House do not want to make their committee votes public. And so the Senate did, in fact, propose this in their joint rule package. And what's interesting is that they would propose, using their Senate rules, would make the votes of Senate members of joint committees public and also make testimony that is submitted to senators public. So this would effectively make committee testimony public and give us the votes of Senate members in joint committees, which is not everything, but would be a little bit more of a step, give us a little bit more information on how people are voting on particular bills. Next one. Of course, they didn't get straight A's. The public market sessions was not addressed. One thing we were really excited to see was that, and could almost take credit for this because but bill summaries was not mentioned by Karen Spilka in her initial remarks and was a key feature of our letter. The Senate does propose making bill summaries for every bill filed to joint committee public, so that's great. But they stopped short of a full committee report, so nothing on, including a summary of testimony, releasing a list of testifiers, giving kind of an update on what changes were made in committee. Unfortunately, that is not addressed in these rules. They did say that they want to move up the Joint Rule 10 deadline. Again, that would be the deadline for bills to receive a report from their initial committee, and it would move that reporting deadline up for bills to December of the first year. So we hope that if the House accepts this change, it would go a long way to kind of speeding that process along. Next one. Start hearings earlier in the session. This was not addressed. Again, they are now 2 months into session. Committee assignments have still not been made. A lot of other states have already started holding hearings, started considering bills. Our reps are still waiting on their committee assignments because leadership loves holding that over the rank and file for as long as they possibly can. So they're not on the wave of starting hearings earlier, unfortunately. No expedite for bills reported favorably last session. They did say that they want to open the first conference committee session to the public, but that doesn't really give us much because they're probably just going to call everyone to order and say this is the conference committee and not really give us much information. We really want to have public conference committee sessions throughout the process of those negotiations. Next one. Next, adequate notice of hearing schedules. So as John mentioned, I think currently they can announce a hearing with 72 hours notice, which is not enough time for working families or anyone with a job to really get there for a hearing. They did extend it to 5 days, but we had requested 2 weeks. So that is still not 5 days. Well, an improvement is still not enough time truly for someone to incorporate that into their schedule. Limiting the number of bills per hearing, they did not address this. There was an amendment from a Republican to add this. That was rejected soundly. Providing hearing speaking order, not addressed, and they did not address the subject of ensuring that incarcerated people can testify. Next. Lastly, they did imply that or add a requirement that a full day is now required to read conference committee reports, because right now they can vote on it just a calendar a day afterwards. So this is an improvement just for conference committee reports, but really does not go far enough to address our demand, and the 30 minutes to read floor amendments was not addressed at all. Next. Our additional demands One was to comply with legislative audit, so they have not made action on this. A Senate subcommittee did meet with the auditor, but they have still gone out of their way to delay compliance with the audit that was demanded by 72% of the population. And some things that we say amongst ourselves, just like, this is an easy win. I mean, what has something been so popular in Massachusetts politics, and they're just kind of slow walking it. And unfortunately, they did extend in the Senate rules, they did move to extend the July 31st deadline for conference reports. So that would mean that conference committee, anything that's still in conference committee by the end of the formal sessions on July 31st can continue to be debated and negotiated into informal sessions, which are completely, just leadership selected, closed to the public. This is just a bad move for democracy. So we were unfortunately not happy to see this. Last thing I think is that just one thing, this wasn't part of our scorecard really, but something that you should know because this might come up in discussions of the Senate's joint rules proposal is that the Senate's joint rules does also propose to reshape the joint committee structure. So rather than having every member of a joint committee vote on a bill in which currently House members have more numbers in joint committees than Senate members. And this is really based on, what we've assumed to be some Senate frustration at things getting caught up by House members of committees, and Senate being powerless to kind of move things out of committee by themselves. So their proposal would be that House members can vote to advance House bills out of joint committees, and Senate members would vote to advance Senate bills out of joint committees. And that's where we're at on the rules. So what's next? So last week, the Senate debated and ultimately approved these rules. There was actually some debates on amendments, mostly from Republicans. There were a couple amendments accepted, but this package pretty much went. Next week, the House is expected to release their House and Joint Rules package. So that's when we'll be looking for things like, does the House include public committee votes? Do they include public testimony? Do they include any of the provisions, such as bill summaries, that were new in the Senate rules? We want to see that. And after that, the House will debate and vote on their packages. So what does that mean for us? Next slide. This is the time to act. And here we are to act. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it off to Evan.
Or Jay?
Oh, Jay. I'm going to pass it off to Jay.
Okay.
Okay. I'm Jay Kaufman. I'm a former legislator, a recovering legislator. And I'm thrilled with the numbers that we have for tonight. There are 130 or so of us. And there's other good news too, in that all of the suggested reforms that we're proposing are really pretty much common sense. And we didn't make these up out of whole cloth. These are the norms in just about all the other states in the union. So we are way out of line, and all we need to do is come into line with good practices elsewhere. So you may be a little bit intimidated of the idea of speaking to your legislator, but just know that all we're asking them to be is normal legislators. We're not asking them to be superhuman beings. You've heard a lot tonight, and you've read a lot in the newspapers as well about the overwhelming problems with Beacon Hill, the dysfunctionality there. I want to say a couple of words, not in defense of legislators, but to explain what is going on in their minds and hearts when we make calls demanding of them that they are responsive to us. They hear from the speaker, who is an over-empowered speaker, probably the most powerful office holder of that sort in the nation. They are dependent on him for a large part of their income because we have this silly so-called leadership stipend system, which doles out about $4 million a year to their favorite legislators, and withholds that money from people who defy them and are independent of them. So their take-home pay is overly reliant on a speaker, which is not true in any other state in the country. The amount of staffing they have is dependent on the largesse and generosity of the speaker. Where they are located in the building is dependent on him. By the way, it's only been hims so far, no hers. And the fate of their bills and their ability to be effective on our behalf and to advance causes that they care about their ability depends entirely on being in the good graces of the speaker. So unfortunately, he has enormous amount of control over everything they do and fail to do. And what we need to do, we, their electorate, their constituents, is have a voice that's at least equal to his. They have to be able to go into the speaker and say, Mr. Speaker, I love you. I would love to do what you want me to do. I'm going to lose my election if I do that. Here's what I'm hearing from my constituents. And the absence of our noise makes his voice the only voice that they're going to hear. So the calls that we're making are really, really important. They have the added benefit of serving as a wake-up call to the legislators who've gotten kind of fat and happy and lazy by just doing what daddy tells them to do. So we're giving them an opportunity to remember why they ran for office and why they care about representing us and to do their jobs, do the jobs that they ran for. And implicit in that is we're watching. And if they fail to do that, well, let's see what the consequences of that are. If they know what the consequences are of not following, not going along to get along, they don't yet know what the consequences are of not respecting our voices. So it's really, really critical that we raise our voices. And I'm excited by the fact that there are, what, now 133 of us here today. If we start making calls and in turn invite others to make calls, they will begin to hear that the ground has shifted. It's not just the 72% who voted once, last November, but we're voting with our calls and with our letters and with our voices now. And we will keep doing that until either they change or we change them.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, Before we go into action, do we want to take like a few quick questions if anybody has them and then take action together? Scotia and Peter, thoughts on giving, let's say like at most, let's say 3 questions before we take action. Okay. If anybody has a burning question to ask, you can ask your question now. I see there have been some in the chat that have been answered. But if nobody has burning questions, we will move to taking action.
I've got one.
Okay. I see Ward and I see a question from Eileen in the chat. So Ward, you can ask yours, and then I'll ask Eileen's from the chat.
It's clear that there's been inaction by the legislature to change this, but have they published any rationale for the things they either decided not to address or that they don't agree with Progressive Mass's suggestions?
I'm happy to answer part of that, but also Peter, Scotia, or Jay, if you want to. If Jay, as a former legislator, if you want to say to what extent legislators ever actually respond to things like that, if they have discrepancies, feel free to chime in. I know that in the past, and I'm happy to share this and follow up. Back in 2019, there were a number, I remember in 2021 again, there were a number of disingenuous arguments put forth behind legislators about why not. My favorite being of an argument for not making committee votes public was, but then my constituents would call me more. Which is not a persuasive argument if your job is to listen to your constituents. I can drop into the chat things that we had before about some of the commonly heard arguments that legislators make against being more transparent, and why those don't hold up. Often legislators will say that anything that makes a better process prevents them from acting quickly. Although what we know is they're a full-time legislature that pushes everything until the very end of the session, so that they aren't acting quickly at all. And they have ample time throughout the session to take action on a pace that is efficient and is well managed across the session, and are the source of most of their own problems. But
Just to add
Peter or Jay, feel free to tag in.
quick word. I suspect many of you participated in Acton's outreach to legislators back 3 years ago. And one of the shocking, 4 years ago, I guess it was, one of the shocking things about those meetings was the primary legislative reaction was to attack Act on Mass and to accuse it of not being transparent instead of trying to actually seriously address the questions. That happened at enough of those meetings that it was perfectly clear that that was talking points that were being provided by leadership. So I don't think they have very good answers, and instead they chose just to attack.
Great. And I was going to bring up the question from Eileen in the chat, and I see a question from Connie. Uh, this is a question that Peter and Jay, you might answer. There was a question of when and why was the bonus idea started by the House Speaker. I know that do either of you know about the roots of the stipend system?
Or
Well,
maybe John Hecht, who's also here.
Heck, yes.
Well, I can give you a partial answer to the question in any event. We, the voters, I think very foolishly, um, um, passed an amendment to the Constitution that sets pretty much establishes a protocol for their salaries, and their salaries are tied to a cost of living indicator. Um, that was initiated under Speaker Tom Finneran, who understood what it was to dominate, but not so much on what to lead. And he did that as a way of helping legislators avoid the difficulty and potential embarrassment of voting on their own salary. It's one of many examples of what the speaker seems to identify as, and a succession of speakers seems to identify as their top priority, which is protecting the members from their constituents. So in any event, the salaries were set in the Constitution, and in order to raise salaries, again, Tom Finneran and the succession of speakers after him built on this, started stockpiling money out of our tax dollars to throw at members who were loyal to them and doing their bidding. It started off with a few, and now I believe the number is 93 of the 130 or so Democrats are so-called leadership Democrats. So I'm not sure who the followers are anymore because the others don't follow. That's why they're not getting stipends. But the stipend system has beefed up the salary, considerably beefed up the salary of a large number of members. And by the way, all Republicans have their salaries beefed up by that stipend system. All senators in the Senate and most in the House are also recipients of so-called leadership stipends. So this is a bipartisan problem, and it has grown. John Hecht has done a brilliant job of sort of tracking this, and the Globe has been reporting on some of this. It has grown geometrically over the last 15 years or so.
Anybody, I can tag in anybody else if anybody else wants to comment on that. If not, I'll bring up Connie's question. Can you hear me now, Connie? I'll let you ask your. You can unmute. Oh, sorry. I think I accidentally unmuted. Okay, try again.
Okay, it's actually Fred's question.
Okay.
Go, Fred.
I'm wondering what can be done in regards to the what the Attorney General is doing, pushing the whole audit process, and how that could impact the actions that we may or may not take. And should we also be considering doing things through the governor's office in regards to the Attorney General's work with the laws that, or the vote that was taken?
Scotia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, this is a great question. So unfortunately, right now, the buck has kind of stopped at the Attorney General's office because the auditor cannot seek legal counsel herself. She has to be represented by the Attorney General. And you guys might have seen the Attorney General right now has been asking the legislature for a bigger budget in order to take on Trump. And so unfortunately, that means I don't think she's going to be taking on taking on kind of the people's push for an audit while also asking the legislative leaders for more money. So we're like kind of caught between a rock and a hard place in which many of us want the Attorney General to get the budget that she deserves in order to challenge a lot of these things coming out at the federal level, also knowing that that means making nice with leadership. And right now it has kind of like gone to a stalemate where the Senate has, made slightly more moves towards complying by establishing a subcommittee that had a series of contentious meetings with the auditor. It does seem like it's going to go to court, but it all depends on whether the Attorney General will take it up, whether they'll allow an additional counsel to be appointed if the Attorney General doesn't want to take up the audit. And it's all kind of in like a legal, freeze right now.
Is there anything that the governor's office could do to assist on that?
I don't know. Maybe. I think as far as I understand it, it's like with the Attorney General right now, but of course the governor has a fair amount of political power in the state, and unfortunately she also has her budget set by the legislature. So
I would say that the one thing in addition to that is it never hurts to like they're elected by the public, they deserve to hear from the public. So the main thing as well is it's always still good to make them hear from you as well that if the public voted 72% for something that they should support its implementation.
Thank you.
But I think that we're good. We're ready to go to the next action step. Okay. And do I need to screen share anything from this? I don't think so. But I think, Evan, you wanted to say a few words here.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, John. So as we transition into our action component of the evening, we have learned so much. I can see the comments in the chat that people are fired up. We are going to be able to lean in to that frustration that we have and this belief that things should be better here in Massachusetts. Before we jump into the action component, I want to hear from people in the chat. We're here, we're learning about the rules of the legislature, we're learning about this dysfunction. What are the issues that people care about? What are the things that you need to change? What are the things that you want to change in your life? Is it maybe immigrant rights? Is it climate action or LGBTQ rights? Post it in the chat. Think to yourself, what are the things that you're really caring about, the things that you want to see change within our state? We see climate action, we see all of it. We see children's mental health. There's more for climate action. There's a whole lot of climate action to happen. Some people need voting rights, healthcare reform, women's rights. These are the things that are our why. This is what we are holding on to when we deal with the headaches that our legislators try and give us. When they spin us the little tale of why we shouldn't be able to see how they vote within committee, this is what we come back to, is our commitment to housing justice, our commitment to a livable planet and education. So all of these things. Now, we're trying to determine more favorable rules for us because this is going to affect the terrain of our organizing. The ways that we care about workers' rights or the ways that we care about a transfer tax for affordable housing, all of that organizing is going to be determined by the rules of the legislature, which shapes the landscape that we're fighting on. And so we're trying to improve this for the next 2 years of the legislature. And at this very moment, also, like I'm thinking a lot about what the federal government is doing. They are acting incredibly quickly on their agenda. Many of us have been out in the streets. We've been at actions. We've been protesting. Because their committees are meeting. Their committees, just on Friday, they released a package through the House Ways and Means Committee of the federal government that would be hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts to the rich and slashing programs that we need. And we might wish that our state government, our committees in our state government would be planning on how to combat these and passing bills through committee. But our committees in our state government have not even been determined. They have not even met because first, before they can make their committees, we have to have rules of the legislature. And so they are choosing to delay responding to the Trump administration because they are deciding just how much should they obstruct us advocates? Just how much should they keep the people of Massachusetts in the dark? What we are doing tonight is we are letting them know that the status quo is unacceptable. So tonight, we are going to be leaving voicemails. If you think to yourself, a voicemail, I want to do a whole lot more than a voicemail. I want to have a protest in the town square. I want to be tabling at the farmer's market. I want to be having a house party with my neighbors to talk about these issues. Please reach out to us. That can be so important, that sustained organizing, and you don't have to do it alone because we can help connect you with neighbors, people in your own town who care in the same ways that you do about bringing our legislature back to work for all of us within Massachusetts. But first, tonight, we're going to be taking two actions. The first of which is going to be calling our own state rep where we are a constituent. Constituents have that sort of superpower where they listen to you, or they should listen to you. They are more likely to listen to you if you are a constituent than if you are not a constituent. And so we're going to be making sure that we are calling our own legislators. And then John is going to lead us on an action of where we're going to be talking to other people to help them call their own their state representative. And so we have a voicemail script because they're not going to be picking up the phone right now. So if you have phone call anxiety or you don't like to talk on the phone, don't worry, you're just talking to a voicemail. And it's important to communicate yourself as a constituent and then let your own state rep know. If you navigate to this link, you'll be able to find who your own state rep is, and you can save their number. Because over the next 2 years, 2 years and beyond, we are going to have many more actions that we can all take, and then you'll have your state rep saved there. But all of us can think about how we can communicate with our friends, family, and neighbors about what we've learned tonight, because we don't want to just learn it and then keep it with us. We want to share, because our friends, our family, or neighbors, they might be so busy working 3 jobs to try and make ends meet that they couldn't come to this session. They can't follow the legislature because it's such a nightmare. And so they rely on all of us to help them know what is going on. So you can tell them how important these rules are and the importance of contacting your own state rep. But this is right now your own state representative is what we're doing at this very moment, is talking to our own state representative. And so I'm going to go on mute, and we are all going to be on mute while we contact our state rep. Is that right, John?
Yes. And so so I'm just screen sharing so that folks we've dropped it in the chat a few times, but it's probably easier for me to put it on the screen as well. Where you can find, I have a sample script. It's long, shorten it. Use the information that you heard tonight to tailor it to what's important to you. But the important things to note is that you're calling your state rep. If you don't already have your state rep's number, you can find it at this link here. It's on the MA Legislature. Legislature.gov, search Find My Legislator. Find that number, store it in your phone. Make sure that they work for you, so they should hear from you. They should hear from you when you're happy with what they do. They should hear from you when you're unhappy with what they do. They should hear from you if you don't know what they're doing. And because that accountability is key. But then we'll have this, if you want to read at any point later, I have a link as well, and if Scotia dropped in the chat too, to that letter we talked about. We have some talking points here that you can use when leaving that voicemail. You note if you don't like talking to other people on the phone, guess what? Nobody's picking up. It's 8:08 p.m. at the State House, but your voicemail does make a difference. Scotia.
Just want to clarify, here we're calling our House representatives because the Senate has already voted on their rules. So what we're doing here is the House rules package will be coming out next week. The Speaker will be having a huge role in determining what that is, but your rep can also have a certain amount of influence. So we are calling our House representatives that we want to see some of these things in the House proposal and the ultimate House package that's voted on in the next couple weeks.
Okay. So I'm going to mute myself as well, and I ask people, you're probably already muted, mute yourself to take a few minutes to make that phone call. When you do make that call, drop in the chat, how did it feel making that call? It should feel good. It should feel like you told that you're telling somebody who represents you, that they should be listening to you and that they should be doing stuff that makes our legislative process more small d democratic. When we see the attacks to democracy that exist on all levels, strengthening democracy here in Massachusetts is a critical way that we fight back. So I'm going to put myself on mute. Again, there's a short link that you can see at the top, and that's been put in the chat. You have a script you can see on your screen. Store your legislator's number in your phone. You're looking for your state rep, not your state senator now. And then happy calling. I'm muting for a few minutes. Vic, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Vic from Sierra Club. I'm the state director, and I used to work at the State House. So if you, I think a lot of you might think you got the wrong number because it's going to the committee. So usually what happens is you could just listen to the answering machine and it will tell you that your office is actually one of, three or four or five in the committee. So listen to the whole thing. Um, and yeah, I don't think that there's any changes yet this year. So they're all just sitting in the committees they were in last session. But yeah, you didn't get the wrong number. They all route to a central committee and then go out to the individual offices.
I want to thank you so much for naming that. I just called my state rep and had to listen to like 11 other names being read before I could dial the code for my state rep. And I know that back my early days in activism in Massachusetts, when I took one time, it was during the workday, and I made a phone call to my legislator, and I got some committee staff answering the phone, and I thought, did I call the wrong number? What do I do? So that's always a helpful orienting flag. Love seeing notes in the chat from people. Awesome. Hope people we can help and folks know if you haven't note that if you make a call today, it's also good you can follow up your call with an email. Again, you have there's a link here. We will also be sending you a follow-up email with all of this stuff because you can ask friends. You can ask a few friends to contact their legislators as well. You can post on whatever social media channels you're still on about why other people should contact their state legislators. Because there is always power in numbers, and we know that legislators often like to say on any issue that they don't actually hear from their constituents about something. And it is our role to make sure that they never have the ability to make that excuse by making it clear that people are hearing from them, or that they're hearing from people. Okay. Do we want to do any close out steps before we then move to calling other people? I'll leave this on my screen for one more minute and then we'll pause and then reorient and do some partial closing and then reorientation.
Do you want to do some celebrating and cheering for anyone on the call who might be contacting their legislator for the very first time?
Yes, that is a wonderful point. I'll give a shout out. You can raise your hand. I'm gonna pause my screen share. If you are contacting your legislator for the first time, you can raise your hand physically or raise your hand using the hand raise function. Love it. I love seeing some people doing this for the first time. Uh, if you're calling your state legislator for the 1,000th time, also raise your hand. I love it. See, what's exciting about that is that there is never a bad time to be doing that. Whether it is your first time calling your state legislator, that is wonderful, and we are so excited that you are doing it. If it is your 1,000th time doing it, thank you for doing it. Keep bothering them. That's what democracy depends on. It's the one of many versions of the line I always like to use is about how 90% of politics is just showing up. And I'll always give credit to Caroline Bays, whom I see here, who noted that like a good share of the remaining 10% is showing up every other time thereafter. And then that work of being present and of following up is so key because most people who are in the legislature expect that they will never hear from you again. So following up regularly is critical to that basic work of accountability. Before we then shift gears here, do any of the other folks, any of the other earlier speakers, want to say any parting comments before I rope some folks here into phone banking? Scotia, Scotia, Evan, Jay, or Peter, any final comments you want to make?
Give them hell, guys. And by that I mean transparency and accountability.
And
I'll just add that.
I just put in the chat the orders from Frederick Douglass: power yields nothing without a demand. It never did. It never will.
I was just going to share that phone banking can have so much power for bringing new people into our movement. I think that it's really important for all of us to think about the ways that our neighbors, our friends, they might be so focused on national politics because there's a lot of awful things happening every single day that they might think that everything is rosy in the Massachusetts legislature. And so we have to be the bearer of bad news to them about the Massachusetts legislature, and also the bearer of good news that there is a lot of ways to take positive, good, important action within our state. Because sometimes people think, I don't need to take action because I'm here in this blue state. You can let them know that we need them, that we need you in our movement. And so that's why we're going to be phone banking and bringing new people into this.
Yeah, Evan, this is Eileen Ryan. I also just heard that Republicans call their US senators like 12 times more than Democrats do. So we can't just think we don't need to call. Like, Jonathan, you're muted.
Thank you for calling that. Such an essential point. One thing to realize here in Massachusetts is because of our state being a heavily Democratic state, many voters will think that their legislators are always doing the right thing at every decision and they don't need to hear from them. Do you know who doesn't think that? Any of, like, people in your district who have the world's worst opinions, people who have lots of money and want the legislature to do things to increase their money, the fossil fuel companies that want to maintain advantage, people who want to see more prisons being built in the state, people who who don't want to see more money going to our schools, who don't want to see housing justice, those folks who enter with large advantage, or like either large advantage and access, or just terrible opinions and think that our legislature is like a communist hellscape that they need to constantly call, those people are calling. And what is critical that we do is it's vital that we are doing that as well, so that we shape what legislators are hearing. They need to be hearing from their constituents regularly about how important it is that they act, and that they act in ways that meet the moment, that ways that bring people in, that respond to the urgency that they feel. And the only way for them to really do that is for them to have actually heard that that's what people want. I like to say that the number one reason why people don't do what you want them to do is you didn't ask them. There are so many other reasons otherwise that can be the case, but at least don't give them that excuse. Jay or Peter, any final comments? And then before I'll do a phone bank training for those who want to continue on. Jay, you're muted.
Let's go ahead to phone bank training.
Okay. And before I do that, Norman,
we've got work to do.
Hand. Guessing that's an old hand. I will pause.